When a company evaluates its manufacturing efficiency, it often looks at a single number, the total overhead variance. But this top-line metric is an illusion. It is a massive aggregate that hides distinct, sometimes contradictory operational failures beneath a single value. By definition, the total overhead variance is the simple difference between the actual overhead costs a company incurred and the amount of overhead it applied to its production. Relying solely on this aggregate number creates a severe problem for management. An unfavorable total variance flags that a financial target was missed, but it cannot tell you who missed it or why. To extract actionable data, we have to crack open this aggregate number and deconstruct the overhead into its distinct behavioral components, variable overhead and fixed overhead. Without isolating these specific cost streams, executive leadership is essentially flying blind. They risk penalizing a production floor manager for a capacity planning error made by the sales department. The standard method for dissecting this metric is the four-way variance analysis framework. This model divides the total variance into four specific pillars: variable spending, variable efficiency, fixed spending, and production volume. This structure relies on a strict operational distinction. Variable costs scale proportionally with manufacturing activity. As production increases, variable costs rise. Fixed costs represent static capacity, remaining unchanged regardless of day-to-day production fluctuations. These behavioral cost assumptions only hold true within the relevant range, a specific expected threshold of normal output. If production drastically exceeds or falls below this range, fixed costs might suddenly change, breaking the model. To apply these overhead costs to actual products, companies use an allocation base. This is the primary activity driver, usually direct labor hours or machine hours, that connects the factory's spending to the units it builds. By understanding the mathematical relationship between this allocation base and the four distinct variances, management can mathematically isolate a failure in execution on the factory floor from a failure in capacity planning. Consider the manufacturing data for Chowdown Incorporated. In a recent period, they estimated a total output of 18,000 units. However, their actual output fell short, hitting only 16,500 units. This table breaks down their variable overhead variances, displaying the relationships between units produced, cost drivers, allocation base, and application rates. Notice the flexible budget. The applied amount is derived using the standard input allowed for the actual output achieved. They base their math on the 16,500 units they actually built. Look closely at the variable overhead spending variance. It reveals a $42,900 unfavorable result. This isolates rate discrepancies, showing the difference between what they actually paid per hour, $10, versus the standard $8 rate across actual machine hours. Below that is the variable overhead efficiency variance, yielding a $13,200 unfavorable result. This metric zeroes in on time, measuring the difference between the actual hours used and the standard hours allowed for that output. There is a strict operational rule here. The efficiency variance is inextricably tied to the allocation base. If an operation applies overhead based on direct labor and the workers are inefficient with their time, the variable overhead applied automatically generates an unfavorable efficiency variance. For Chowdown, these variable losses point directly to the production floor. Management overpaid per hour of machine time, and the machines operated too slowly. Now we look at Chowdown's fixed overhead table to see if those same execution issues apply to static costs. We immediately encounter a structural paradox. The static budget and the flexible budget amount for fixed overhead are identical. Both sit exactly at $450,000, completely ignoring the missed unit targets. This happens because fixed overhead is a lump sum cost. It does not adjust flexibly to match actual units rolling off the line. When we calculate the fixed overhead spending variance, subtracting the budgeted fixed costs from the actual costs incurred, we see a $21,000 favorable variance. Despite producing fewer units than planned, the absolute fixed spending was kept under tight control. The factory spent less on static costs than they budgeted, yielding a favorable outcome regardless of their production efficiency. This leads to a critical rule in cost accounting. An efficiency variance is calculated for variable overhead, but never for fixed overhead. The efficiency of production simply does not affect the total lump sum you pay for a factory lease. Returning to the data, we focus on the final calculation, the production volume variance, which sits at a $37,500 unfavorable penalty. This variance is calculated by taking the budgeted fixed overhead lump sum of $450,000 and subtracting the fixed overhead that was actually applied to the units produced. This number represents a capacity penalty. It measures the exact cost of the fixed overhead that was absorbed by unused production capacity. Management spent the money to build 18,000 units, but only produced 16,500, leaving that excess capacity idle. When it comes time to assign accountability, the stark difference between variable and fixed variances becomes clear. While variable efficiency and spending failures fall squarely on the shoulders of the production floor manager, the production volume variance rarely does. Unfavorable volume variances are usually triggered by forces outside the factory. A sales team missing their quota, sudden labor strikes, or poor planning by executive leadership can all force a facility to operate below its budgeted capacity. This flowchart visualizes the complete diagnostic architecture. It places actual, budgeted, and standard cost components side by side, clearly illustrating how the numerical deltas form the distinct spending, efficiency, and volume variances. Evaluating a floor manager based on a production volume variance directly violates the principles of responsibility accounting. It punishes an operational leader for macro-level capacity issues they have no authority to control. The four-way variance analysis provides the necessary granular control for an accountant, but for high-level executive reporting, these details are often compressed into broader organizational metrics. In three-way variance analysis, variable and fixed spending variances merge into a single total spending variance. Efficiency and volume variances remain isolated. Two-way analysis consolidates further, combining total spending and variable efficiency into one large flexible budget variance. This broad flexible budget metric is also known as the controllable variance. It groups together everything the production manager theoretically has influence over, purposefully separating it from the uncontrollable production volume variance. True financial mastery depends on the ability to pull apart an aggregate failure and isolate its mechanical faults. It is the process of translating mathematical deltas into precise operational interventions.